Well, hi there. Oh, I've got a list of things I've got to do with this guitar. And what I haven't done, just bear with me a second, I've got my notebook. I'm doing this as a double-edged thing. I'm doing a setup on this, but I'm also going to use a part of this to do a section called Fixing Fret, Buzz and Slap. So it's C01. It's from my ebook, upcoming ebook. So C, and this becomes C01, this bit here. Okay, so that's good. So I've got my list of things to do. So let's get back to it. So here we've got Kevin's Dave Gilmour style Strat. And look at that, it's nice. Now we've got some, oh hell, what were these? Forgotten the name of them straight away. Creamery, no, not Creamery, oh God. Iron House gear, not Iron Gear, come on. That other brand that are quite good. Anyway, so here we have a set of nice pickups. So this guitar basically was, don't bother about that, it's just a personal guitar, it's not going to be resold. But this guitar was a Harley Benton, or is a Harley Benton Stratocaster. And they did make a Gilmour-esque style one, but I don't know if this was that one or whether this was just a black, white and maple affair, and definitely these are being changed out now. Typical old age, I can't remember the name of the pickups, for a plate with the Gilmour switch wired in, which switches the neck in with any other combination. And so it has got a great tone, needs a little bit of fret work, and we're going to replace the plastic nut with a Tusk one, and Tusk string trees, which are over in my department of string trees. Here is a Gear for Music that Paul donated today, which hopefully will go to Emma's school once I've just cleaned it up a bit as a freebie. Anyway, so we have a couple of things to do. So we looked at this, and the action on here is beautifully low, but we're going to change it for a different nut. We're going to put Tusk on here. While we were looking at it, I was trying out the tremolo with the screw-in arm, and to be fair, it didn't feel that great. And Kevin, like myself, hated the screw-in arm. And then we looked at the back, and it's the standard cheap zinc block, or lightweight zinc block. So I said, look, Wilkinson M series makes a solid block 52.5mm spaced bridge. Why don't we do a direct replacement? And I'm not quite sure straight away whether this will be a direct drop in. I can't remember having not, if I recall, not done a direct swap out before, but let's just have a sort of quick look. I'm trying to get some decent close-ups on this as well as we go through. So I shall remove the M series thing. These are really good quality for under 25 quid, including the postage. So we've got an identical line up there. What I don't know 100% is whether we've got the screws lining up in exactly the same place, but there's probably no reason to suggest why not. Sorry, you could sort of glimpse it there for a minute. So there we've got the full weight block, and bent steel saddles, so they're kind of very similar. It's got little black screws here and black rub screws to kind of add to the black vibe here. So for under 25 quid, that seemed like a good change out for basically gaining the block, and more importantly the push-in arm, which comes with that thing, Wilkinson, the M series, zooms out. So that's what we're going to do. So first on my list was the visual check of the new tremolo, done. Hopefully it's going to work. What we don't know at this point is how much room there's going to be at the back. Now quite often, not all the time, but quite often, these sorts of guitars can have just enough room in the gap to allow you to do a floating tremolo without too much problem, hopefully without routing anything. On my gold parts caster that I'm building off to one side, I had to do a little bit of routing because it was already a sort of small gauge body, the Encore India body, and that really didn't have any space for the tremolo block to move, so I had to make a little template and route, and I could, if necessary, reuse that little template to widen the route here, but hopefully we won't have to do it. So there we have the basic Harley Benton thing. But you know, hopefully once we swap it over, we'll see whether we've got enough movement. Worst comes to the worst, we may have to add a little tiny bit of free space in there, but we can do that with the extra route. Okay, hopefully it'll be straightforward. Now we've got good quality tuners on the back here. I mean, they're Harley Benton quality, but they're perfectly good, bearing in mind that the tuners play almost no part in keeping the guitar in tune. They are there to make getting it into tune straightforward and pleasurable. Now, what am I going to do with this? I'm going to lock down the original tremolo at this point, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the fret leveling first, and I'm going to set the action on this guitar as if the tremolo wasn't working or being used at all. So the way to do that is to screw it in quite a long way, most of the way really, and then this will pull the plate down flush on the deck of the guitar. It's a sort of spring-based lockdown. Okay, that should be, yeah, that's as good as lockdown as you can think. It's sitting a little bit high, but I think it's catching on the, this. Sorry, you can't see that. Let me show you again. I think this is a little bit high when looked at from the side. So we've got it touching down on the back, pretty much. Oh, there's no movement there. See, that's touching right there. But it's sticking up a little bit here, and I've got a feeling it's because it could be holding off or catching on this piece of the replacement plate. So we might want to widen that a little bit. And that side as well, that's okay-ish, but we don't want any touching at all, so we'll check that. But right now I don't really mind too much what that's doing, because what I'm going to use this lockdown for is only to set the playing action, which I can do as long as that will stay in the position where it is. There's no reason to worry about that. So we've also got a 12-inch radius gauge. The actual radius on these guitars is 13.5-ish inches, so you won't get a tusk nut in that radius. So what we've gone for is a 12-inch radius, which is so close to 13 that it probably make no difference at all. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to get my little adjuster, and I'm going to set the playing action where I want it to begin with, prior to doing the setup. So these are currently all over the place, so we'll just take this down on the E. So my leveling technique is to set the ideal target action that we want, and then make the frets comply with that. Now, for that to work, I have to have the confidence and the experience to know that, all things being equal, on a guitar with a wooden neck, a bunch of frets, and some strings, a bridge and a nut, I have to know that there's nothing about that will not happily perform at a certain action. So I have enough experience to know that. So my target start action will always be comfortably achievable. There's nothing about any wooden neck, any set of frets with any standard bridge and nut that cannot be played at that sort of action. Anyone who tells you otherwise will be wrong, except for the only other variable in that which can affect it is if it's a very tight, small measurement radius. So on a 13 and a half inch radius, as this one is, there would be no reason at all why we can't get this low action as I'm setting now out of it. If it were a 7 1/4 inch radius, a vintage tight radius, then chances are I know that we're very unlikely to get such a low action without there being some choking introduced, and that we have to sort of conquer that or take care of that. Yeah, I can see this is sitting is jammed up on the edge of this thing. It's not a problem for now, we'll take care of it later, but right now it's kind of held in place. Yeah, so the nice thing is for any radius above 9.5, the action I'm going to set here is perfectly achievable. Below that, at the 7¼ inch vintage style, then you have to either compromise and set a slightly higher action, or you have to do a bit of extra fret leveling to get to where you want to get to. So I'm just checking this. This is at the moment because it's quite flat. It's quite a bit more lowering to do. So I'm just measuring the last fret action. A lot of people don't use the last fret. They like to use a measurement as given on the 12th, and that's fine. It seemed to me logical for what I do and the way I do it, for me to use the last fret for a bunch of reasons that if I could be bothered to explain or go into, I would. But there are some good reasons why it suits me to do that, and as a result, that's what I do. And so when sadly sometimes people say, why are you doing like that? Fender measure it by the such and such 12th fret, and you think you're better than Fender, and I've been doing this for 45 years and I've always used the 12th fret. That's fine, you know, don't get in a tiz. The reason I use the last fret is because that's what I like to reference to, and I'm used to it, and it's perfectly acceptable for me. Okay, so we're going up from 1.4 to a bit over here, so this one's slightly too high. So what I'm doing is I'm setting 1.5 on the low E across in a kind of gradient to 1.2 on the high E. So everyone a little bit different, but between those two figures. Now, at my target action, what I'm finding straight away is that the first fret action, or the nut slots, may be slightly too low. Now that means if the action had been high to begin with and somebody had cut the nut slots to make them perfectly low, let's say they aim for the 0.3 that I like, lowering the action at this end is going to have an impact on the action at the other end. Now there's quite a bit of slack in these strings. Now we've got an action that's good at this end. Unfortunately, it's a bit too low at this end. Now what we could do at this point is change the nut over straight away, and that will sort of pause us a little bit and take a bit of a time. So here we are close up. There's the nut, original nut that was in there, and you can see at the target, excuse me a minute, you can see at the target action that I would be aiming for and have set it to, that now brings this down too low. So it's cut too low for a good low action at this end, which is where we are now, which is quite a lot lower than it was. So to be confident that what we're hearing here hasn't got any nut first fret rattle, which is probably fairly important, let's have a think. Is it that important? Let's see, can we? It's not that important. It only really makes an issue on the first fret. I'm not going to change it yet. I'll leave it where it is. If we think about everything from that first fret upwards, you can hear there's a little bit of zizz on all of these. clean. So we've got a fair bit of fret slap in this area here. Now what I'm going to see is, let's just check what's happening. Well, we're practically flat for a start. Now this has currently got 9s on it, and Kevin is going to want 8s on it afterwards, but we're going to level it with 9s on and set all our equipment for 9s, and it's still going to level it perfectly well. And then we change it to 9s, and we'll adjust the neck relief if necessary. But this is too flat, which is why the frets in the first half of the neck are showing up a fair bit of fret buzz. So we can just get these bloody things out. So the thing to do is, let's lift these out, push them to one side, if we can get them to stay out of the way. Not very well. And we want to dial this counterclockwise, so we fit it in and dial it a bit counterclockwise, and then wiggle it out, and then we'll check and see if it's brought us any. Feels better already. So it's now put a tiny bit of relief into the neck, hardly any at all. So this can be a challenge on cheap Chinese necks, that we can find that there's not a lot of relief available to us. So we're at a loose position now, and what I don't know about this truss rod is whether it goes positively in the counter direction and dials in some positive relief, as in forces the neck into a relief, as opposed to just leaving the strings do the work. That's what happens on the older type truss rods, but I will have to just keep turning this until I come to see whether there's a positive point. Because if it's the old style, once you're slack, it just keeps going. But this one's now tightening up in the counterclockwise direction, so that tells me we should be able to put a little bit of relief into there positively, which it now has a very small amount. Great. So all of that that's cleaned up. So what I'll do now is, while we can, let's take off the strings, or slack the strings off, and we'll mark up the fretboard ready for precision fret leveling, which point I'll go into section video C01. You'll hear on this video what that is when I get to it. One of the things I was thinking I should also do on this video, what was I thinking? I've got to make a video at some point about making truss rod adjustments. I've got several of them, but it's kind of important to, I'm going to still think of what these pickups are called, and I still can't remember. I know Kevin's screaming at the video now, they're bloody such and such. Did I write it I probably wrote it in my book. Let's see if I did. Yeah, I wanted to make another video about, did I write which make they were? No, I didn't. Anyway, yes, another video about adjusting your guitar once you get it back from me. And I think the first point about all that is, sometimes, not often, but occasionally, sometimes I might say to people when I send the guitar back, I might put in an email, you know, later on in the year, if you find that the neck goes flatter by any amount, you may find the notes start to buzz. And what that will mean is that, what it generally means is that the lower that we set an action, the less tolerant that action is to quite natural flattenings and curvings of the neck under different climatic conditions. So that's a fact, and it's for that reason that you have the truss rod and you have the adjuster, and it's there for you to use. And sometimes people think, well, I've paid you to do it, I don't want to. You know, I'm basically frightened of doing it, and I certainly don't want to do it after I've paid you to set it up. Now, the strange thing about that is that, well, okay, we're happy to stick with that. It means that if down the line it goes, you know, the weather changes and the neck flattens very slightly and it takes away the tiny bit of clearance, we had, then you can send it back to me and I'll make an adjustment, send it back. But I don't want to have to do that, and I don't want you to have to do that. So for that reason, I always say that adjusting your truss rod is one thing you must be able to do, and it's not a defeat for you or me for you to be able to do it. You know, you're not getting a cheap service from me. You're not admitting some sort of defeat. It's absolutely what you need to do, and more so if you like a low action, because that has less tolerance for changes. Slightly stiff tuner there. Now I probably shouldn't have marked up this thing in the black pen. I always do this because I'm now wanting to do a slightly different section of this video. So I've done section 1, visual check of the tremolo, part 2, lock down the original tremolo and set the action. So I've got a workable first fret action, very low. I've got perfect last fret action as I measure it, and I've got a little tiny bit of neck relief, which is anything more than just none is what I say as your start point. So we're ready to level, but now welcome to video section C01 for the ebook, and this is about precision leveling, and basically it's about how to level out high and low frets, and also how to free up high E chokes when you bend notes. And to have demonstrated if we've got any high E chokes, it would have been good if I hadn't have already painted this Harley Benton converted Stratocaster, so that now if I bend it, it's going to get mucky. But here it is set at the action I want. It's quite likely, now it's lower at this end, it's quite likely that when I try to bend notes they may choke out. Or more not. Well, that's not bad. Well, we got a bit of a zzz, zzz at that point. We're almost losing the thing, but you know, we've got it's made for the ebook. It's made this a little bit different. Actually, that's the action on there is too high. So let me just take this down a bit and we'll see if we can introduce the kind of buzz, no, choke out that I'm looking for, and then we'll have a reason to do what we're doing. Now this is looking like it's not going down, and I have a feeling now this could be because it's sitting slightly on the it's not intonated properly, and I think it's just possibly sitting slightly on the screw here. So I'm going to just take it down a fraction more and get ourselves down to the target 1.2. That's more like it. It's even a little bit high still. So now if we finally get down to here, now this is actually almost decked out. There's about a mil, 3/4 of a mil before we actually drop that saddle right on the floor. And this now is close to the action I want. This is too high still. So I'll just make a couple of tweaks, and now having set a more taxing but still the correct target action, I would suspect that we may now introduce some choke outs into this, which is probably would have been where I should have got in the first place. And this part of the video is about new techniques, and the new technique I'm going to be looking at in here is curing or leveling to alleviate fret slap. And of course that means the definition that I made earlier in the ebook about the difference between fret buzz and fret slap is important here. So let's just get these exactly right. So it's a little bit high, and that's partly because of the way all this is sitting on the screws nearly. Anyway, be with you in a second. I promise this will be all worth it when I've set the action right. So it's got a little bit more downward to go. Right. So when you set up your action like so, where you want it, and it's quite low, then what you find is it can be that the saddles are right on the ground practically, and you can leave them there because that's settable and we can work around that. But it's possible that you might say, well, I hate them being that far down, I don't want them sticking up into my palm, in which case you could consider shimming the neck at this point in order to bring the neck up closer and reduce the gap, and that means your saddles can stand higher. That tuner's very stiff. Just about choking out there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this, restart, and call it the section that I need for the ebook. Hold on. Yay! Professional. My clapperboard's knackered anyway, but there's my sound signal. Okay. Welcome to ebook segment C01, and in this area I'm looking at new techniques that I've developed in the 8 years I've been using this level of fret methoding, this method of fret leveling. And in this, well, when I first started doing it, I was looking at the idea of just leveling frets. Since then, I've learned that this doesn't just level high and low frets, but you can use this technique to level out the overall unevenness that you find in a single neck. And the reason why I've focused on that over the years is because that unevenness, rather than just focusing on the single frets that maybe aren't seated properly, or perhaps one's been hit in too hard so it's low and it makes the subsequent one feel too high, rather than just focusing on those, you get another kind of buzz, which I made a distinction and called it fret slap. So fret buzz I've reserved for the kind of choky buzz sound that you get from a single fret standing up too high, and you tend to find it in one spot only, or maybe a maximum two very distinct spots on a single string, or I call these tracks, right? You might find in the E track you might find one or none or maybe two at most fret buzzes, and they will be, when you hear those, you'll know it will be caused by a single high fret or a single low fret. But that isn't the only problem. There's another buzz that we can find accompanies us up and down the fretboard on a number of frets in the line, and that tends to be because of the bumpiness, overall bumpiness of the fretboard, which you can't see with the eye. But as a principle, I've drawn this out in another video, but there's no harm in repeating it. If we think about leveling as we understood it in the old days, we would have our neck, and on the neck we would have frets like so, and we'd have probably one big fret over there. And as you know, the idea of fret leveling would be to level off the frets and chop off any bits and bring the frets to an evenness across all of them. If that one's still a bit low, then we have to take it all down a little tiny bit more until all the frets reach this one, and we have them all level. Now I've drawn that slightly curved, but actually in fact most people have experience of leveling the frets with the neck off the guitar, or the strings off and the neck flat, and they level with a leveling beam and check the levelness with the fret rocker that looks something like this. And that's fine, that's one way of doing it, but the truth is, when you put the neck under compression, what you get is some strange thing happening, and it's because the neck is being compressed from end to end, which I call longitudinal compression, for want of a better term. And it's creating what you can see now under pressure. It's not only bending it so you've got a bit of relief, but it's also creating some bumpiness, bunching. So you've got your frets on there doing their thing, and you'll see that in a way the frets follow the shape of the neck, and you'll see that the frets also go up and down. But what's great about the method that I use, I call this an imperfect curve, right? And that's not hard to see why. It's a piece of organic wood that under pressure bends with a bit of neck relief, if we leave the neck relief in, but you tend to end up with a curve, a bit of curvature, an overall curve, but in detail the curve is actually a little bit uneven, so it's an imperfect curve. And so what the banana method is fantastic for is, if we place our brass nuts, as we might say, onto the fingerboard as we do, and then we create a smooth curve between all those 3 points. And so straight away you can see that we've got two things going on now. We've got the truss rod curved into a more or less perfect curve. Now I'm not stupid, I don't mean that's scientifically perfect, but by comparison I know that the truss rod, the banana, bends fairly smoothly and in a linear kind of curved fashion, but I know that the neck on the guitar is slightly bumpy and bunched. So now you can see that thanks to our sample, okay, because we only put 3 of these little brass things down, I'm sampling an average of this bumpy curve. So at that resolution, which is a very low resolution, imagine it in terms of dots per inch, it isn't, but imagine it's 3 dots per inch if it was a picture scan, incredibly low resolution, you wouldn't see anything. And in this case it doesn't map all the curves or the bumps or whatever, it just says it approximates an average between these 3 sample points. And so as a result, because the banana can only curve in a linear fashion, it returns, when you calibrate it to these 3 brass things, it turns the banana truss rod into an approximation of that imperfect curve, but it does it with a nice perfect curve. So all of that being said, if you take away all the frets and stuff clogging up the view, right, you can see that the perfect curve, when it sits on top of, forget there were any frets there, if I put that perfect cutting surface now down on top of that imperfect fingerboard, you'll see it will cut down this bit here, it will cut the top of that hill there, cut the top of that hill there, and it will eventually even out this valley, this little valley here, this little valley here. And the idea would be that ultimately, with a bit of work, your perfect curve would be imposed onto this slightly bumpy, bunched, imperfect thing. And in doing so, you clear a little bit more space for the spinning wound strings. And that's the amazing thing about this technique. So that's what I'm going to do in this leveling. Sorry, Kevin, I've taken this opportunity to do it on your watch. So the first thing was to just recap the definitions. Fret, buzz being mostly connected to one high or one low fret in a particular place on the neck. Then there are fret bend chokes, we call it buzz chokes, which tend to happen when you bend a high E across into what I call the G track, as when you do make a big bend. And then the third one is, and this is these are the kind of the new areas here, the learning since last time, or since I began doing this in 2015 with this method. We have this one that I now call fret slap, which is important to distinguish because this is the result of the undulations in the fingerboard taking away or getting in the way, providing some hills that get in the way of the spinning strings, and particularly you hear it all the way up on, or large parts of the neck, on the wound strings because they spin more and they're floppier pound for pound. So since starting doing this, all I knew that it was good for leveling frets, and actually leveling the frets is about 90% better than not leveling them at all. So I'm always thrilled to it when I discovered how to level frets with the traditional method, with a neck dialed flat and there are no strings on. Getting a dead flat beam and leveling out all the high and low, or leveling out the high frets and maybe bringing it down to level out the low frets was great. 90% better than not doing it. But this longitudinal compression that brings into play this fret slap particularly, this is like the other 10% of accuracy. And actually, I have to say, I started out by saying it was about, 10% better than doing it with just that method there. But actually, it's more than that. In some cases, the amount of hills and valleys and the amount of unbearable fret slap it creates, and when you tidy it up, I think it can be up to, be honest, up to about 30% improvement. I mean, these are made up figures, but it can be a substantial improvement. So that's why I'm a big fan of it, and that's why I do it this way. So things I've learned since then are about the distinction of these types of things. So what it means is on any setup like this, what I'm aiming to do is take care of all of those three things. Now I do this actually all in the same way, or sort of during the same process, but it actually involves thinking differently as I go along and acting slightly differently. And I'll see if I can, the aim of this video section is to try and communicate how it's different. And particularly for those of you who, this is a repeat, I've already talked about this in the previous setup, but I'm no harm in repeating it. But it's if you've used this method before, this technique before, then hopefully this will give you an extra level of mastery of this fabulous tool. Now, I did mention in the other video that I now use almost exclusively this, what do they call it, this thing, U-channel truss rod. It's a bit wider than the original one I started out with, but it's slightly stiffer, and I have come to value its stiffness as an ideal characteristic. And the reason for that is, if you think about that thing about imposing the perfect curve onto the imperfect curve, if this is the perfect curve, then I far prefer this to keep its shape as I'm pushing it onto this. I don't want to push it on and have this flopping about and assuming the shape of this. I really want this perfect curve to clip off everything it has to remove to allow it to transfer its curve onto what is essentially an uneven surface, but we can take away some of the high spots or high clusters, which I call the hills, and bring them down and balance them out with the valleys. So it's at the beginning, when we're talking about individual frets, we're fret leveling, get rid of fret buzz, and then we sort of tend to, by the time we get halfway across, we tend to be ironing out any fret bend chokes, because the place that they bend is across into the G track. So it's around about the G track that I'm leveling to remove any bend chokes on the high E's. And then from there onwards onto the wound string, I'm thinking more fret slap, because it's more often than not that's the thing that's spoiling the playing feel of the guitar. So we follow the traditional technique. So we use the 3 brass doofers to, I call it, calibrate this tool, but what we're doing is we're sampling the curve. We're sampling very, very broadly at a low resolution. We're sampling the curve on this, but we want it sampled. We want it to be this average across this perfect curve. So it's not a good representation, but it's a perfectly workable one. So I'm making tiny adjustments, which if you used these tools before, you'll know just how small those adjustments need to be and how good you have to get at assessing them. But that's the time served thing. So having set the calibration right for the E track, as I call it, I'm now going to use the leveling tool, the banana, first time, and I'm barely pressing down. I'm just running it with gravity against the frets, up and down. And the great thing about this, it's Friday night here at the recycling centre, so it's party night, I think, and the owner throws it open to a local Hells Angel chapter or something. Okay, so I've some of the frets, I've already kind of rubbed off a lot of the marker pen. But when we have a quick look now, it was difficult to get the best view on this to see what's happening. So we can see cutting, 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 cutting more. So that's a slightly high fret. Those two feel slightly high. Cutting, okay-ish, 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 okay-ish. Cutting, but a little bit low at the edge. How well you can see. Then we go none at all. So we've got a valley here, and then we back up and we're cutting quite heavily. Then we've got a bit of a valley, and we've got some. The fret ends are low all the way down here, but we're cutting past them, just inside of them. So that's the first part of this technique, is I'm leveling to get a sort of diagnostic of the fingerboard. And now normally what this will do, and this neck isn't too bad, but typically when I've done both of these videos, this one and the one I did last night, I'm failing to find really bad necks, so I can't demonstrate. So the first port of call now is, having done that initial level, there's a low spot, and that's making that ziz a bit. If I were to bring this up with my trusty zoom in assistant called the mirror, if I were to zoom into there, let's see if we can see, oh god, come on please, zoom into there. Where's the one I think is doing it? Hold on a sec. Okay, so I'm finding that right there is a bit of ziz. Now can you see how these two, apart from the very edge, but just back from the edge, they've got black marker on them, these three in fact. And that means when I'm fretting that note, it's just going slightly into a ditch, hence that noise there and that fizzle. Cleans up there. So that tells me that these three are low, and the impact, it's just making those fizzle a bit. Now it's not choking them off, and it's not exactly at the level of fret buzz. It's a general sort of what I call a preliminary fizzle. If I could just see what I'm doing, that would help. Yeah, so it's telling me that I can hear the effect of that low edge. Now what I'm going to do, what it will drive me to do in terms of technique, and this is for the ebook readers, buyers, as well as anyone else, is now I shall go back with the same calibration, and I'm going to go back to this, and I'm going to focus a bit on this end. And by that I mean I'm going to press down just a tiny bit at this end as I level. And the idea now is I'm looking to just bring the surrounding frets a little bit down to the low part of those frets that you saw, the low ones that weren't being cut by the blade. And the reason I'm doing that is because the low frets, and there's a couple more here that I need to address, but the low frets ultimately, and they're still there, they pretty much dictate what you can do, because one or two low frets after each other creates a dip, and once you're pressing the fret down, sorry, the string down inside that dip, it'll make the following frets appear higher, and they will then make fret buzz or a bit of zing. So I'm expecting it there still. It's not bad, but it's a tiny bit, and then I should be expecting it here too. Not too bad, but to be perfectionist, when we see that not touching, we know we're in a low spot. And I would always encourage you, if you're using this technique, is to just see where the low spot is and just transfer, do a little bit more general leveling, not too much pressure, but if any push, slight push at all, I'll be doing it on the spot where I can see the low spot, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to bring the surrounding frets just down a little bit to not bottom out exactly, but to bring them a bit closer, even them out in terms of the low spots. And if we kind of cut down the difference between the two, then we get rid of the effect of the low spot. Okay, that's okay. So now we keep the same calibration for the second track, the B track, and again I'm aiming to read the fret, the way the frets cut with the paper. 400 grit paper on the banana tool. Now if you've got a maple neck like this, you actually, sometimes you can just do it a little bit and watch the fret dust accumulate, and it'll sometimes tell you quite quickly where the high spots are. And so what it's telling me, and you may not be able to see this terribly well, but if you can see, there's a kind of mucky spot there. So that's a high spot. Okay, that's not a problem. That's a low-ish, sorry, that's a high-ish crowd of things there on the B track. But the important bit is there's a low spot there. That kind of gap around the 12th is a bit lower than everything else, and we can see one low fret in there and still a low fret in there. So and there's a very low one right at the end, but that's again not a problem because it's the very last one. But what you're getting is an overall sort of topographical view of the neck, and the more you do this, the more familiar you'll get with reading what it tells you. Let's just brush off this dust. Now many people have worried about fret leveling dust. It's not ferrous. It's not ferrous, and it won't stick to the pickups at all. So don't worry yourself about it. The only fret metal that I've found, fret wire that I found, has even the slightest attraction to a huge, powerful neodymium magnet is Evo Gold, and that's very, very slight. It will just, that huge, big, full-size, sort of 25mm diameter magnet will just about move a piece of, just cause it to pull towards it, a piece of Evo Gold. So that means there's a little bit more ferrous metal in that alloy than any of the regular fret metals. But in this kind of stuff, it's got no magnetic or no ferrous attractive properties at all. It cannot be pulled towards the magnet. So what I'm doing now is I'm calibrating for the G track. Now before I do that, the G track is where you address any chokes when the strings come across into the G track. So it's usually when they come across from the E or to the B. Now if you get the E's cleared, then the B's usually are perfectly fine because they're not as far down, anchored as far down the radius. And in this case, this guitar is quite flat radius anyway, not like a 7.25 vintage, but it would really make a difference. But so let's say that's a little bit of zizz out. What I tend to do is I tend to get a close-up view of this if I can. Let's have a look. What are we looking at? We're looking at the 12th fret. Let's zoom in on the 12th fret if I can, make it vaguely visible. Oh, not so good, maybe so good. 12th fret, sorry, 12th fret. Okay. Let's call it here the 13th fret. Now what I'd like to do is to bend it. Listen out for the point where it chokes, if at all. And I tend to go and mark with my finger, or mark with the thing, where it is that the E string is on the next fret is choking out. So it's choking right there, and then I move that out the way. And can you see how, if you can see, I hope you can you see how that point there is to my side of the G? So we need to level that out a little bit more, and we're looking at leveling on the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th fret. Got that? So the 15th fret will be my target to free up any bends. So I'm going to zoom out so we can see again. There we are. Sort of, that'll be okay. Yeah, so I'm going to level now on the G. So I'm going to calibrate for the G, and I'm going to level with a view of just easing out that zizzing on the 15th fret as the E string gets bent across. Now on my calibration here, as I get to this point on the neck, I'm feeling that it needs a tiny bit more curvature in here. So I'm going to just make the tiniest adjustment until the idea, as you know from using this technique before, if you've read had my other ebook, you're looking for all these things to touch down on this at the same time, and I always start holding down on the left one, and I want the middle and the right hand side one to be contacted at the same time. Now you can sort of wangle it so you can get what you want out of it, but it tends to be, you get used to when it's in the right place, and that means this is calibrated as a good average of that curve. Remember the imperfect curve. So I push that out of the way, and now we're going to do the G. And remember, I said that the 15th is the one I want to focus on. So I'll treat it like all the others. I'm going to start by gentle leveling across the whole of the neck, sort of mostly gravity. Remembering this is 400 grit paper. It can take quite a lot, but it won't do it massively quickly. So I'm looking at how it's cutting, and in the light I can see that it's cutting everything. That's a bit high, but we know that. We kind of know that one's already high, the 8th fret. And we've got a couple of low ones up here that aren't being touched, but everything else at the moment seems to be being touched. And we've got, I would say, the what's this, 5, 7, 8th, and maybe these two a little bit cutting. So a couple of uneven ones in the mix down there, which we're just clipping off, and then 2 very low ones at the end. But the rest of it now is sort of evened out. But I'm going to now think about the 15th here, and I'm going to put a little bit of pressure down at this end as I work on, in my mind, I'm working on the 15th fret here and the frets around it. So that's the bit where I kind of gone from thinking about individual frets causing buzz. I'm now thinking, I'm at the stage of thinking about the alleviating the bend choke on the high E at the 15th. So if where are we going from? So we got a tiny bit there still. So 12, 13, 14, 15th. I'm going to just do a little bit more on the 15th. So the aim of that is to just clear a little bit of a way for the string, a tiny bit of clearance. But you know, we've set a difficult challenge where we've set a start height of playing action on the E of about barely over 1.2 millimeters, and that's tricky. I mean, that's the target, the lowest target I would aim for. So what we're hoping is that it should, yeah, that's not bad. Playing all the way. So that's the focus on the any possible choke outs from the high E bends. That's taken care of. And now we're on to the thinking in the third stage, but we're still effectively doing the same thing. We're leveling the frets on this neck, but now we're into a part of the neck where the thing that mostly shows up is the effect of those ups and downs, that the series of hills and valleys, and the hills are the ones that steal away the room that the wound strings need to spin. So now I'm looking to, I'm looking to kind of smooth those out. Now this doesn't want to move that way at the moment. Usually that's about right. You can hang them on another string slot. So here we go. Now this is about removing fret slap. So once we're over into the kind of part of the neck, i.e. the thicker wound strings, it's even more important at this point to make use of the perfect curve, because now you're thinking of the series of hills and valleys, and what you want is this lovely, smooth, perfect curve to come down onto the peaks of the hills, and to just, without flattening out, you want it to just clip off the tops of any little mountains that are presented in the topography of this neck. So at this point I'm really concentrating on repetitive movements but less downward pressure, and I can see again where the high spots are, here, here, here. And so if I'm hitting kind of high spots, that's good, because I know that I'm bringing those high spots down a little bit closer to the lower parts, and in bringing that down we're evening out the dips, and in evening out the dips we're creating out a little bit more room for the wound strings. pretty good. Now let's just have a listen to the A. Sometimes when these guitars you get a really good demo. Five, six, seven. Okay, 5, 6 and 7. Let's say that's our target for clearing up that little bit of fret slap that's accompanying on 3 notes. So it's already not like fret buzz, it's on 3 notes, possibly a bit more. So already it's in more than one, so we're kind of into calling it fret slap rather than fret buzz, and suspecting that it's because of these high frets which we knew in the middle. What did I say? 5, 6 and 7, which is where we know there's a high spot anyway. So I've calibrated the tool again, or checked it. It's still the same as the last calibration. And now I'm going to work in here, and I'm going to again just use it as a to and fro, and doing this very lightly. You're mapping the perfect curve onto the hills of the perfect curve onto the hills of the imperfect curve, and in doing so you're balancing out and creating that little bit of extra room. So there's no harm just doing it gently without too much downward pressure, but you're also giving yourself a diagnostic where you can go high, 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 so you know where your high and low spots are. So we'll just brush off the dust again, and now we said what, 5, 6 and 7. Better. Do a tiny bit more. Now the tiny bit more or not a tiny bit more question is a judgment one, and for me it's based on knowing how much I've taken off, and whether I've got any further scope, or how far am I from a place where I would be in any way uncomfortable about the amount of metal I've taken off. And that really has to be, there's no clever way of measuring that, and you have to learn that through the process of doing, and I'm happy with that. I know already that's as good as I'm going to get that. So now I'm going to just calibrate the E track, low E track, and yeah, so where do I stop is an important judgment call, which you can only develop a sense of it through doing, and that's why I highly recommend you practice this a lot, but do it with guitars that you don't feel too precious about, because in doing so, the last thing you want while you're learning or trying to learn something is to put yourself under huge pressure. That's only going to, shut down the learning you can do. So one way to put yourself under pressure is to use this technique on a customer's guitar when you're not comfortable with it. Another way of doing it would be to set about doing it on a guitar that you really like or cost a lot of money, if you're not experienced in it. So there we go, we can see again high spot right here, which would cause me that buzz on the 5, 6 and 7. High spot up here, low spot there. So the low spots have kept where they were all the way through, but this tells me right now that that's good. I've taken down 3 key high spots, one around there, 2 key high spots on the thing, and that's the primary hills that are standing up, the 2 major ranges of high spots. Now again, we're getting a little bit there, but that's because we know that 7 is a high fret. Sorry, 8 is the high fret. 7 in this case. So that's why we're getting that little tiny bit of slap still remaining. But when you're that close, it would be indecent not to finish the job off. So we sort of keep it at gravity, mostly gravity, its own weight, not too much down pressure. And then I'm just focusing a little bit on this 7 fret, knowing that that's the only place I really had any sense of there being a bit of zizz. And that's flattened it out a little bit, and that will, I can see by experience, that will round out to a nice fret. There'll be no problem reshaping that. Of course, we're out of tune. So now we've got a much lower action here than we had before, and we've got rid of pretty much all the fret slap, and there weren't too many choke outs as in bend chokes, but we've evened out what little one there was. So that is the fret leveling part of it done, and the normal thing that follows on from this is the recrowning and washing the hands at some point. Now what I'm probably going to do on this guitar now, if I'm going to stop and restart, I'll probably replace the nut at this point, which is really nice. It's just the right height, so it's but I'll replace it since I've got the new one here. I may, looking at the height of this one, it's quite a deep slot, which is unusual. I may find myself cutting a piece of a booster, a boot, to lift this up slightly. The spacing is almost identical, probably a tiny fraction wider on this one, but that will be fine. But like I say, I may boost it with a piece of scrap plastic or tusk material. It could even be new bone or something of a similar colour. It's a little bit yellower. But anyway, I may do that first. So that's it for section CO1. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next section. So back, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the nut, and you can see I've pulled the strings out of the way. Now it's kind of good, but what I really want to do is be able to turn it on its side and tap the nut off, but having used my block as the string retainer, I don't have a chance to do it quite like that. So I may try it, tapping it from the side, and see what happens, but it may end up being a resistor and fight me. Okay, so in the last section you saw the leveling part, and in a short while I'm going to be doing the crowning part, but I thought it'd be good, while we've got strings on, a good time to get sorted with the nut. Let's have a look. What can we see? We can see, let's zoom in a little bit. Yeah, so not a best angle to start on it from. That's grubby plastic, but it's decided it wanted to crack rather than come off. If necessary, if it doesn't lift out of its own free will, that's got a kind of cracking sound. The trouble with this is you can never tell whether it's ripping stuff off the bottom. That's not too bad, but yeah, plastique, beautiful plastic. I might borrow a bit of this to boost the other one. That's a really deep nut slot. Yeah, if it hadn't come out, then I do quite enjoy shocking people by removing nuts with a Dremel cutting disc. So this, I think this is going to, first of all, it's going to need to be just gently reduced down width-wise. So I'm just going to very lightly sand it just to get it in to fit. I'll get a bit grubby while I do this. Sorry, I've just moved you out of the view. I'm so sorry. Keep forgetting. Now, the downside of a deep nut slot is that you have to pay real attention to it being this exactly the same thickness. You can't afford to end up with a slightly wedge-shaped piece of tusk. So this is still. Let's just do a comparison. If you're not sure what's going on, if you've got the right size, simple thing to do is switch it on, measure your removed, the one you've just removed. So that's coming in at, it's trying to be 290 I would say, and this is probably running at 330, so there's a bit more to come off there, and we can do it slowly with this, or we could go to a heavier duty sandpaper. But when it comes to a 15 or 12, 13 pound nut, it doesn't make sense to rush. Oh, you still there? Yeah, you can see it. So I know what I'm aiming for. I'm aiming for just under 3, and I'm currently at 3.2. So I might just push this out of the way for a minute and avail myself of chunkier material. Now I could either, I've got some options. I could get myself a customized cutting thing, and I might just do that so you'll probably be able to see there. I've got a piece of sandpaper which has pretty much run its course. It's on a brass block and it's very handy to have. What I think I'm going to want to do is replace this. Sorry, it's a bit sort of, perhaps one of the things I wish I'd done off camera, but I didn't. So, oh, there goes that. I'm going to use a piece of my duck permanent tape on here like so, which is just happens to be almost identical width to the piece of brass, like that, just missing on the edge. Get that like so. And then I can take me a piece of this to there, cut it off with the scissors, cut it a bit long just to be on the safe side. I'll be with you, I'll be with you. So that can go in the bin, that can stay for another day. Right, we're going to take off the sticky. So having a flat sanding block is vital in guitar work, and some people have brilliant, you know, expensive flat sanding, what do they call them, belt sanders, and I feel jealous beyond belief. But I only have blocks to play with, so I'm just going to move things enough to cut that off there, cut that off there, and then I've got me a fairly chunky block, and that bit can go in the bin along with that and that. Right, so this is just about getting the width of it down to right, so I can see how far in or how deep the slot actually is. So let's bring this back to where you can see, Right, so there's the thing, there's the thing, here's my thing. So next to the thing, I'm just going to place this stuff down, and I'm going to very carefully do some sanding. And now I'm using a much tougher grade, about 180. So this is going to thin it down pretty quickly. So we'll be very careful. And again, the calipers is always good here, so you can always keep check. 318, 318, about the same. It looks square, so it's not kind of tilted over, and we're not going to end up with a rhombus-shaped piece of tusk. And then we're getting close to it. And as we get close, then it's smart thing to do is to go back to the lighter paper, lighter grit side. I'm just going to do a tiny bit more on this treble end, and then we're going to flip over to the slightly tired, ready worn yellow side. I think this is probably 240 grit, this yellow. It's a bit lighter, a bit gentler. So with a couple of swipes of this, we should be getting close to the fit. It's starting to just slip in there. Said the tortoise to the gardener. We can still see this is coming in at 3.9 still, 3.4 at one end. So the treble end is thicker, so we've got to pay a bit more attention to the treble end. So I'm going to press down on it a bit more. Not massively scientific, but it tends to be the way it works. Starting to get ready to go in. So a bit more on the treble side. And then a bit more generally. And we're nearly there. You can see it's starting to it in, but it's still just too snug. If we don't have to bulk it up at all, then that'd be fine, but it does have an unusually tall slot, or deep slot, which is, I'm not really sure I'd noticed that before in a Harley Benton, but it's much deeper than a Fender, and I guess Tusk has made their nuts, as Fender drop-ins more than anything else. That's where they think the market is. Okay, so we're nearly there, and again the treble side is still fractionally too thick, so I've got to try and concentrate on just leveling that a bit, or flattening a bit off that. Right, nearly there. Okay, that's just about settled in. Doesn't quite go down. That's fraction wider, that's okay, we can take care of that. So now we're seated in there, and the thing to do, which is great from having kept the strings out like this, is I'm going to reverse my thingy here. Right, we're actually not quite flat out, so we don't have too much to boot. And there we're a bit there. Yeah, so we will end up needing to put a little riser on it. But it's always good to check it through first. Okay, so we're a little bit taller at the treble end as well. Okay, so sometimes, oh that's right, so that's nearly in. Sometimes they don't fit perfectly in because the glue is still in the slot, so I may have to just clean that out. So either which way, I'm going to need a bit more, it's still going to be a fraction too low, so I'm going to need to boost it just slightly. So I'm going to take off all the strings again, or slack them, hook them around there. I should have made these pegs higher up. My mistake. Right. Okay, so out you come. So that's all good. I'm just going to take a tiny bit more off there. So we are fractionally too short, and it's actually slightly thinner at that end than it is at that end, but we get those into there. Fits nice, but we do need to do that careful bit of squaring off in here, and there is some glue caught in there as well, so I just need to try and take that little bit out. We don't want to dig it too far out, we don't want to make it any wider than we already have, but just take away any obvious residue. And the most important thing is that the corners of the slot are clear of detritus, otherwise you don't get a clean fit. Okay. Ultimately, once you get a nut in place, providing it goes in and sits firmly where you want it, it's not the end of the world if there's a tiny little gap, but it's sitting down at that end but not the other end, so there maybe there's a little thing causing a little rock in the middle, like what's the word I'm looking for? A little fulcrum, a pivot, no, a peak in the middle. So again, we just very carefully clean it so it's nice and tidy. If it's not dead flat, it will potentially sort of rise up and it will sit on a hump in the middle of the slot. It's a pretty nice condition slot, generally speaking, so I'm not too worried. But it's just fine-tuning it to make sure it's as clean, as functional as it can be. So there's a little bit of width to take off, and now that's clicked into place on that side, but it's not clicking into place quite so beautifully on that side. So there's a sense of something holding it in the middle, so it feels like it's sitting slightly proud. Now it's not going to be the nut itself, because that should be dead flat. Sorry. So just again, we'll just double check this is all smooth. It could be, it could be as little as a piece of glue on the side causing that to hold up their catch and not go down properly. So it's just a matter of clearing it as much as we can. Because sometimes people find it's really hard to look at if it sits in perfectly but not quite. You see it's got a sense of pressing down at this end, as if it goes down at that end. Now we have the Hosco slot cleaner, which is pretty nice tool, but the problem with this is that it doesn't really want to fit all the way through here because it's just a little bit too tight to use, and so we don't want to force it because we don't want to widen the slot any further. So all I'm going to have to do is just hope that everything is nice and smooth and flat, and just kind of grind it out like this as best I can. It would be nice to have a sort of nut coloured bedding material, really, like they do on guns. I think it's for bedding in the sights, isn't it? But yes, it'd be nice to just drop it in some bedding putty and have it sit there nicely. It's got a tiny bit of give in it, but I feel that once it's in, pressed down both sides, it'll be okay. But it is too low, so we now have to go for a boost, and we've got the choice of using an existing material that's too bright. I've got a spare tusk nut here, which is the same material, but it's up to that point. It's actually it's a good nut, so it might be a shame to use it, but we still could. Yeah, let's use it. Where did this come? I think this actually came out of somebody's guitar recently. I think what I'll do is I'm going to sound piece of tusk because it's come from a guitar, but it's not being used now. So I'm just basically flattening it out. Actually, I bet you now what happens is I'll get it nice and flat, and I bet this will fit perfectly in there and do the job. Whereas I'm just currently flattening it to make sure it will glue nicely to the underside of the nut I've already just thing. But if anything, this will be outside of the radius that we want. In fact, it's a 9.5 minimum. So what I'm doing is well, you can see this, but I'm just checking for flatness now. And the best thing to do is hold it up to the light. It's almost perfectly flat already. So I'll just do a little bit more flattening. I mean, worst comes to worst, if you don't get the shape you want, you can fit in another nut like this that's actually too shallow as well. But you can put another nut in and cut it down to get the right radius. That's another way of doing it. Always like to try to avoid cutting the slots, so I prefer to finish up with the factory slots being the working slots for the guitar. To me, that's the best bet you can have. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to join these two together very carefully, and that is as clean a join as I can possibly make. And then I'm going to obviously wear one of these out. So that one's a little thicker than that one, but that's okay. It's so tiny as to make not to make a difference. I'm just going to spray a bit of activator on it. Activator. Activators are go. Right, so now we have a back-to-back nut, which is too big. So what I'm going to do straight away is I'm going to cut this one down to a desired size, which I know is going to be a bit less than we originally had it. on both sides, like so, a tiny bit of a cut down. Now I'm going to wear this down into a straight line. I know which one I'm leaving as the top section. And what I'll aim to do is to come down to a very thin, extremely thin boost of plastic, or sorry, tusk in this case, underneath the working nut, and it would be so thin that we couldn't achieve it in any other way. So this will take a while. We could potentially just cut it with a rasp or something like that, but if you do it by hand you keep a good control on it, but it takes a while, and it helps to press down so that the joint is as strong as it will be. So it's my way of giving it a boost, a sort of shim, working shim, just so that we can keep the original nut slots and have a nice quality tusk nut with the correct height without having to put in a larger one and cut it down to size. So I'm just doing movement as I cut it down. I found in the past that's the best way to get an even, controllable, square-bottomed cut. If I move around with my fingers in any other side-to-side motion, it very quickly goes off, becomes lopsided. Okay, so still a fair way off, but we'll get there, and it'll be fine when we do. So as we get closer to nearly the right height, what I'll obviously do is I will stop with this sanding. I'll go to the finer sanding and we'll put it in, and we'll take a measurement of the strings to make sure that we know how much we have to reduce, and then we'll measure the either side of the nut itself, and we'll wear it down until we're at the target size, and we'll kind of stop at that point. So it's a lot of fiddle, but it's worth doing. If it's worth doing right, it's worth doing, or something. Okay. So we're still basically wearing this down, not quite anywhere near the right size yet. Sort of heading there. So today is the first day that we've gone into a bit of cloudiness now. Kind of expecting it to rain a bit tonight. The gardens absolutely need it. The gardens sound like I live in a stately home. The garden, the suburban garden, absolutely needs it, because it is dry as a bone. So I got to admit, it's about time it rained. It's 24.5 degrees, or nearly 25. It was nearly 26 when I started a little while back, but it's not too unpleasant. So sorry about this boring thing. That's how it goes. It takes as long as it takes. So we're coming down towards the size that we want. And you know, when you get to the end of this, you realise you've basically done all this work to end up with a cigarette paper thick piece of plastic stuck to the bottom that you couldn't measure in it and create in any other method than this. You have to only get there by sanding it down until the point where you're at the height you need. Okay, so we're not far off now. I'm just going to concentrate now on squaring this up so we aren't tipping forward. And then once I think we're nearly square on the bottom, I'm going to stop and I'm going to get ready to place it and do a measurement. I think we ought to be looking at the thin side of the filing paper, you know the stuff I mean, sanding paper. Okay, so our nut will probably go in there. It's probably slightly oversized. Let's just have a quick look. No, it shouldn't be. Maybe on that side. We'll just bring that flush on the lettering side. That should be absolutely dead smooth. So nearly almost get in there. So it's a difficult one. I'm a mixture of slightly too tall still, and I don't want to push it in because it's going to be slightly too thick, and I don't want to force widen or end up widening the slot or making this too narrow so it ends up rattling about, because we want a good tight fit. So we're sort of near the fit point, right, and that's as far as it will go, far in as it will go, but it has that little bit of, oh no, that's in perfectly. Right, so with that in perfectly, the easy way to do this now would be to basically call that quits and cut down from there with the nut files. It's actually not far off what we want, but we'll measure it anyhow. So we'll put it under load. Close, close. We'll put the strings back on, put it all under load, and then we'll calculate from there where we need to be. Okay, so let's get it tuned up and have a quick look at it under tension. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is, with my filthy hands still at this stage, hopefully we haven't run out of batteries yet, it's all good. What I'm checking for is to find out what the action is now at both sides. So I'm thinking this is going to be about 6.6 of a mil. Let's try 0.5. Yeah, 0.6 or 0.7. Let's go 0.7. 0.75. So 0.7 on the, I'm just going to make a note, 0.7 on the treble side, 0.7 on the treble side, and let's call it 0.6, 0.6 or 5 on the bass side. Okay, that's 0.6. So call it 0.6. 0.75, 0.65. So on the treble side we want to reduce by 0.45, takes us to 0.3, and on this side we want to take out 0.3 minus 0.35 on this side, which will take us to 0.3. So we're close. So now what I do is take these all off again. Nearly there. Worth doing. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing right. Okay, so here is my nut, and what we now do is we now draw it on the board like so, Here's my measurements up there. Okay, we're taking off 0.35 from the bass side and 0.45 from the treble side. So to help this along its way, we draw the nut like so in 3D, and we go in the low E slot and in the high E slot there will be a measurement. So we take the measurement in each of those places. Let's see if I can show you in front of the camera. So we go low E and we measure the low E, and of course the blade of the caliper goes in there, so you get 4.5 here, and we'll get a higher one at the treble side because it doesn't go into it, we're just resting in the notch. Alright, 4.7. Okay, so it is a bit higher, 4.7. So what we do is we take 0.45 off there, which equals target of, well, if it was 4.253, okay, target is 4.25, right? And we take 0.35 off here, and the target minus 0.35, and the target should be 4.15, would you say? Plus that 2, 3, 5, yep. 0.35, yeah. Targets. So we know that we're taking a little bit more off the treble side than the bass side. So here we go again. And we're looking to stop at the measurements we've got there. So now we're looking at the squareness, we're looking at which side has got more to go, treble or bass. So the treble's got a bit more to go. So now we're cutting down on the treble, a little bit heavier on the treble side, but more importantly, or as importantly, we're looking to square this off flat so it sits nicely in the slot. So a bit more still leaning required. I'm just keeping it straight. Yeah, a little bit more towards us or away from us might be easier. The treble side. So we put it there, and try and square it off. That's the important bit. We want a square seat in the slot. Okay, that's good. Now we're going for the measurement. We want 425 on this treble end here, 474, and on this side here we've got 475, 474, 474. So okay, we're now going, time to now work downwards. We've got the squared offness, let's now work down. So we'll go back to the rough side a bit, and we will do some earth moving now, hopefully keeping it as square as we possibly can. Looks good. Clear the swarf out of the way, or the gunge. Again, go back to measurement. We're looking 415 on the bass side and 425 on the treble side. 415, 470, 460, 417, 460. So we're about 10. Right, so we're going to do some more. This time we want to keep it pretty much straight. Same on either side. Okay, and we've gone off on a wonder here, so it's going to be a matter of reclaiming this now. It's not too bad, but we'll tilt forward to get back to flat. That's about right. Again, check. 415 on the bass side, please. 415 on the bass side. 438. 433. It's looking good. So ease off onto the softer stuff. So this is how you eventually get a tusk nut sized from the bottom up for your guitar. and that means you end up with these factory smooth 439, still a bit high. You end up with the factory smooth slots in play. So about 1/10 of a mil left to go, so we're going to do it on the yellow side. We're going to keep on focusing on the squareness of it all and just carefully take it down. Checking for squareness, and we get there in the end. We're going for 4.3, we're at 0.15 of a mil, and we're at 4.28, so we're a little bit off on the base side now, so I'm going to continue working at, but almost entirely pressuring the base side. Okay. 4.28. There's the slot. It's hard to feel it. 4.3. We're almost there. Tiny bit more on the base side. Everything's looking nice and straight. Checking the flatness. I was pleased to finish this nut, I tell you. Okay, on this side we've got 4.24. That's almost bang on the mark, as close as you can trust the measurements. And this is come on, 4.24, fractionally high. But you know, we can afford a tiny bit more on the base side if we have to have it. Right, that's your lot. So there is a, ow, cut myself. There is a slightly raised up nut. We've cut it to a tiny bit more off the end. I'll take a tiny fraction more. What did I just do with the brass thing? There it is. So a little bit more. Again, this is quite hard to gauge, so we're really in a sort of suck it and see guesswork around this point. Rounding it off as much as possible. Don't want these things to dig into the hands. So, sorry, probably not a very good view. Feel it. Feel it, feel it. Flush, proud, flush, proud. Tiny bit more. Right. Clear out any bits of grime. This actually probably doesn't even need gluing in the way it's looking. Let's just get it quickly redone up. How can you see? How are you doing? You're doing right. Right, we'll get it quickly done up. We haven't even got onto the what's it call it yet? Tremolo. Fingers crossed. This is a straightforward drop in. Okie dokie. Looking good. Up.